Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar on the third report on cross-border trade of plastic waste in Chile. This is a look at the impact of plastic waste in Chile. This is the third report, and we are very happy to be able to convey to you people the information arising from the whole of the process. 2 years since the amendment on plastics, and then well, this amendment was ratified by Chile in 2020 during the Conference of the Parties of the Basel Convention. We deem it essential to provide visibility to what's happening with the import and export of plastic waste in the country. And we have been able to prove the impact of the waste, not only of plastic waste, but textile waste in the north of our country. We have a huge illegal dump of clothes in the Atacama Desert. I'd like to introduce the people that will be with us today. First of all, Matias Roa. He's an engineer in transport, a member of Zero Waste Alliance Chile, and he had to survey the information for this report together with Manuel Rojo, environmental management engineer, member of Environmental Justice, and he works in the National Coordination of Zero Waste Chile. We'd also like to welcome Bastian Barria. He's a social environmental activist in Taparacá, and he's a part of the Desierto Vestido or Dress Desert Foundation. We'd like to welcome Javiera Fernandez, geologist, co-founder of Desierto Vestido, and also Beatrice O'Brien, sociologist, researcher, and a national coordinator of Fashion Revolution Chile, founder and manager of a co-op. Bastian will first tell us about the territory-based experience of the community of Alto Hospicio, Tarapacá, their experience with textile waste, and then we will hear the experience of Fashion Revolution, and we'll hear about the outcomes of the third report by Matias and Manuel, and finally we'll have questions with the important presence and participation of Cecilia Aburto, who's an engineer in renewable natural resources, University of Chile, and a degree in sustainable urban development at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. She has over 15 years experience in environmental fulfillment, public policy assessment, and international instruments linked to environmental management, natural resources, and she's in charge of the international chemical agenda at the Ministry of the Environment. And also we will have the presence of another colleague who is in the climate change, environment, and ocean department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Chile. Also present will be Tomás Sayek, civil and electronic energy engineer, Universidad Santa Maria, who holds a master and a PhD in science and technology policy studies of the University of Sussex. He worked at the Corporación de Fomento de Producción and he's a professional at the Ministry of the Environment, coordinating projects such as the roadmap for circular Chile as at 2040. He's currently the head of the Circular Economy Office at the Ministry of the Environment, and also we will have the significant participation of Carla Pozo, researcher uh, of the Santiago de Concepcion University, and she is a part of the SPLATCH group, or Scientific Plastic Pollution Alliance of Chile. We welcome all participants, guests, and we thank you for your participation today. So now I will give the floor to Bastian so that he can start with his presentation. Bastian, are you co-host? No, you haven't assigned me as co-host yet. Francisco, please do so. Francisco will now give us a hand with this. There you should be able to share your screen.
Perfecto. Sí.
There we go. We will be together with Javiera. We will be making this presentation. I'll give the floor to her first. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting us to be able to disseminate our 3-year work. Bastian, please, next slide. If you look at this picture, you will be wondering what happened. You probably saw this on the social media too, where this happened, what its impact was, and we're going to talk about this in our presentation. We're going to tell you what happened. For those who don't know us, we are 4 youths from the Tarapacá region. We work on caring for the environment, and we were trained at a youth leader school at the national level, and we represented the Tarapacá region. And once we graduated from the Circular Economy School, we continued working to date in our region. So all the pictures you're going to see from now onwards were taken from our on-the-ground research work. Our main pillars are education, among others. These are activities we've carried out with children, youth, and adults. Next, please. Another pillar is research. Our second pillar, we've had several interventions or carried out several interventions at the national and international levels, shooting videos, documentary films. And we've had exchanges with the community. We've been called upon to participate in different events at the national and international level. And our last pillar is advocacy. We've interacted a lot with the population at large at the regional, national, and international levels.
We now move to the route. Yes, the path of secondhand clothing trade, and we will go into detail later on. We understand that this secondhand clothing business in Chile is not legislated. It comes from the great industry of fashion in Europe and in the US and Asia. And this secondhand clothing is what is not sold due to this fast fashion trend and is nowhere to be sent. And that's why we receive it, which seems to be the textile dump site of the fashion industry. Now, what happens when this clothing arrives in Chile? Well, it arrives in our port, in the port of Iquique. We have some figures on the screen. It increased in 169% when talking about tons, from 60,000 in 2020, 2021 to 1,5,900 tons. And this is what we see in our port. You see the red line, and this is the free trade area. This clothing is bought, selected by importers. These importers arrive in this area and they move to the second line of this route where they select these pieces of clothing. These are 4 categories. The premium that sells nationally and internationally, the second and third category, which are what can really represent what cannot be sold, whether it's faulty, it's out of season, right now and right here cannot be sold, and that's why it's transported. Next, please. And this transportation, and you can see the route, you can see the red line, 15 to 30 minutes, takes us to Alto Hospicio, which is a different municipality. It's next to Iquique, and this is where we find this waste, whether housing and industry. These are the legal landfills, the municipal landfills, but there's no percentage of textile waste. At least it's not categorized or accepted. So this transportation is illegal indeed, and these are trucks that come from the free trade area to Alto Hospicio to dump this waste in any area around Alto Hospicio. So let's talk about Alto Hospicio now. Alto Hospicio has been suffering for more than 20 years. We've conducted a survey. People don't know about it, and it becomes a sacrifice area, a suffering area. You can see the picture. You see houses, but they're not really houses. These are illegal sites. There are more than 40,000 people who live there next to these dump sites, these textile dump sites. We can see to the left our colleagues there. There's not just clothing, but there's also all types of waste. And we know about Alto Hospicio, which burns their waste because of the amount between Iquique and Alto Hospicio that is actually covering our land. Alto Hospicio, again, sends more than 70% of their waste that is dumped in the municipality of Alto Hospicio, and more than 100,000 tons of clothing, which is the clothing that is not sold, coming from everywhere around the world, received at our port, is dumped, as you can see here on the screen. We also see on the screen to the right, red circles. We see in our site visit, we witnessed next to the sea, right there next to the sea, the great waste dump that is also being burned. And we see that we couldn't find it, not just there, but the higher red circle. This is where on a daily basis, this clothing is being dumped. Now, can you remember? Do you remember this picture, it went around the world at the beginning of the year. It went viral, and we have access to this area due to our line of work. We saw on the news, both nationally and internationally, that if you could possibly compare on the right, we could see the greatest clothing dump site, but this at the beginning of the year was really fake news because this is the municipal landfill. This is fake. This is legal. We do not confirm this. And now Bastian will talk about the current state of affairs, where this is being dumped and where exactly this ended up being disposed of. Good morning, everyone. Just as Javiera was mentioning, in 2021, June to be more precise, last year, these articles, this textile dump site recognized and acknowledged around the world was burnt almost in its total amount, almost 100%. You can see that in the images on the screen, and we can see that these clothes were buried, 100,000 tons in this area called Paso de la Mula were burnt, and we can see the before and after results. We followed up on June 11th. This is where this was intentionally burnt, of course. And on June 24th, a few days later, we realized that all these clothes were buried, and you can see something that resembles a volcano that is being incinerated below ground. We could actually see underground how this clothing would still continue to burn. These are the pictures of where this dump site took place. These pictures really went viral, as we said before. Now, what's happening now? We talked about the burn, and we talked about the context and the intentional burn, but the issues, the concerns are still here. There's still comments on social media about what was burned, what was not burned, what is happening now, what we see with this large amount of clothing. But let me tell you that the situation has changed quite drastically from 2022 until today. And we will focus now on the sector of Caleta Buena, which is on the way to the area of Hospicio. We can see here the sector on the screen that we'll refer to. The pictures that you see on the screen are pictures of the same sector, same highway, where we don't see many people living, but it's in between, it's like in between, it's in a valley area. So clothes are being dumped. They don't do it next to any type of housing areas. There's no people living around it, but they do so in between the dunes and the low mountains, but behind them. So it's hidden to some extent. This is a video where we see how the sector is being used to dump these clothes. We've seen in situ in our visits that these textile dumping is still there, but it's mostly being dumped and burnt almost immediately. Now, let's just not leave this as that, but let's go in detail with a more in-depth analysis of the neocolonialism that we're experiencing in the textile industry in Alto Hospicio. We believe it's unfair from an environmental perspective, and we believe that Alto Hospicio, due to the fact that these people are more vulnerable from a socioeconomic perspective, have to witness this experience that is affecting them. They become invisible as such, and it becomes contradictory. We think of more popular areas like the northern Ovelial with great large dump sites, tons of waste, and that's where we wanted to go in detail about the textile concerns. And this is something that was unthought of. We never thought we would see this unless it was a horror movie, but this does take place in Alto Hospicio. It takes place in countries in Africa, in the global south, and we think that we need to take a more global look at what's happening right now.
But we don't only want to look at negative aspects. There's a lot to be done, and we can't be paralyzed by the great challenge posed by this problem. And the local actions in Alto Hospicio, we believe, have global consequences. We can bring about the change here in Chile, in Tarapacá, but there must be powerful triangulation with joint work between the public and private sectors, and not leaving out civil society and civil society organizations that are working out in the field. There are many initiatives and organizations that work at a local level to be able to address this issue. For those who wish to learn more about all that's happening, well, here you have our social media so that you can follow us. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bastian and Javiera, for this great presentation. One is a bit shocked, in fact. The situation is quite harsh indeed. Now I'd like to give the floor to our colleague from Fashion Revolution. Beatrice, you have your presentation handy. Sorry, I didn't bring any presentation. I wasn't told to prepare any. I didn't think this was a requirement, and I've been pretty busy this week. My presentation has to do with a more general overview. But first of all, I'd like to thank you for this invitation. I love to be able to share our ideas with the public at large, and cooperation among us is essential, particularly in current circumstances. For me, this has been a week in which climate change and all that's happened to humankind with the natural disasters have turned this into a concern for everyone. No one can look sideways regarding the heat waves and all that is happening. So thank you and congrats to the team. I know you've been working very hard in the last few months to publish the report that's very important for the environmental organizations, ecosystem information and data. It's very important to know what we are talking about, what solutions we envisage, and how we can move towards a more sustainable and environmentally friendly future, addressing the different issues, among them clothing. Why clothing? I'm going to provide a general context as to why clothing is an issue nowadays. The production in the last 15 years has doubled. These are all estimates because this is a global industry. But in the year 2000, we made 50 billion, and by 2015, 100 billion garments were made. This is due to the globalization of the textile industry, and it's due to fast fashion. in Atacama and Alto Hospicio, the textile dump is linked to fast fashion. Why does that happen? Because fast fashion has multiplied the number of garments produced and worn currently. Fast fashion is based on two pillars so that we know how it grew so much: the globalization of the industry, access to cheap and abundant manpower, particularly in Southeast Asia, where you find textile workers that collect very low salaries, working in unsafe conditions many times with little protection. Most or all of the fashion corporations, I'd say, don't own their factories. Instead, they outsource their activities, and this puts workers into a very vulnerable situation. In the Rana Plaza tragedy in 2014, for instance, this is how a fashion revolution was set up after this event. And the other milestone promoting fast fashion is synthetic fiber production, particularly polyester. We consider nowadays that 64% of all the fibers used in garments are synthetic or man-made. Why is this essential? Because synthetic is produced based on fossil fuel, but synthetic fibers can also be produced based on coal and gas besides oil. And there are countries, developed countries, working on producing synthetic fiber on the basis of other elements other than oil, but most come from oil. They can be produced cheaply and quickly. Since these are man-made fibers, they don't require specific climate conditions. We don't depend on nature. So synthetic fibers can be produced almost endlessly. Since we are talking about the report on plastics, we must understand the key importance of synthetic fiber in this overproduction we face nowadays, and the impact that this synthetic fiber will have on whatever is dumped. It's not the same to dump clothes made from natural fibers and from synthetic fibers, because these are non-biodegradable and they will pollute underground water and have many other effects. And as Bastian and Javiera mentioned, there's incineration too. When synthetic fiber is burnt, they release a significant amount of toxins and contribute to global warming and climate change overall. That's why it's important to understand the linkage between fast fashion, overproduction, and the problem of waste that we face currently. Having said this, and to wrap up what I wanted to say, the sustainable fashion has made quite a bit of progress lately. We tried to find ways to shape or better shape this industry. We looked at the challenges, and we've talked a lot about the impact of garment production, the production of fiber, of textiles, and the sewing up of all these clothes with a social impact. And this has had pragmatic consequences on the territories where clothing is produced. A fashion revolution aims at transparency for consumers and citizens. We want to know where our clothes come from, who made them, and how they made them. So in 2021, Fashion Revolution launched a global campaign to see where our clothes end up. Just like we look at transparency in the production process, we also call upon transparency for the dumping of these clothes. What happens with the clothes donated in the north and how these clothes come down south. Transparency is a key factor to understand where the problems lie along all this chain. In the case of Chile, we have huge textile dump sites, but we must look at this from a global standpoint. It's not only a problem of Chile. If Chile closes its borders and does not accept worn or used clothes, they will find somewhere else to go to. We must be very clear that the message to be conveyed with whoever we talk to and in our work is that the textile industry has overproduction and overconsumption. There are too many garments, there's full accessibility, and people are promoted to use more clothes. And there's a constant turnover. And then you have the mass media. We have marketing and ads for consumers to change their designs, their models, and garments are cheap. So this is a commodity with huge effects and impacts. We have to see how we solve this. That is what I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you, Beatrice. Just like you get in this overview, in fact, you gave us a lot of information. So if we close our doors as a country here in Chile, beware, because this textile waste will end up in another country, and that's not what we want. We've got to address the cause, the root cause of this problem. So thank you very much for your comments. I now give the floor to Matias Roa so that he refers to the outcomes of this third report on cross-border trade. Here I am. Yes, I'll be making this presentation together with Manu. I'm going to share my screen. Francisco, can you make me co-host, please? You are co-host already. Go ahead, please. Let me know if you can see my screen, please. Yes, yes, we can. Good morning. I'm Matias Roa, and together with Manuel Rojo, we are members of the Zero Waste Alliance in Chile, and now we will give you an overall review of this third report on cross-border trade. It's our third year of research work in which we've tried to identify plastic waste, particularly these are tariff headings 3915, waste pairings and scrap of plastics, with 3 sub-items specifying what kind of plastic waste is traded. The trading of waste worldwide is a fact. But not only plastic waste is traded, there are lots of other types of waste related to these. To give you an idea, electric and electronic waste and textile waste that have something in common, and that is that in their composition and in their production, they include plastic material, which will then turn into plastic waste in the future. What do I mean by this? So far, many organizations have only looked at tariff heading 3915, but technical information from certain world organizations have proposed expanding the scope to other kinds of waste. Go ahead to the next slide, please.
So, as we were saying, the array of waste that contains plastic is more than just an item. For this third research, we added to it what was related to movement that is recognized or known as clothing and or secondhand accessories and clothing. So the total textile sector, which is not possible to identify certain aspects such as features of these textiles or the state, the status in which they are, as we saw with previous presentations, Fashion Revolution and Desierto Vestido, we can witness what's happening and we see what data has been gathered. We see the logics behind this colonialism movement in the textile waste trade is happening, and its origin is in the global north. All this information was gathered from the customs office in Chile. They're available to everyone. They were processed and assessed with the intention of identifying these tariff heading 3915 and 3909. These belong to 2015 to 2022, so 8 years of data gathering, and we used the heading 6309 called secondhand clothing and accessories, but there are 17 sub-tariff heading with different types of clothing items such as jackets, accessories, underwear, turtleneck sweaters, etc. The bibliography shows 5905 as another tariff heading of interest, but most of our study and research focuses on number 6309. And finally, it is possible to identify 17 sub-items, which is something that quite shocked us in our analysis of studying plastic waste. We've only analyzed 4. So these 17 came as a shock. Let's start by talking about textile waste. To date, we have a systemized methodology which has been applied in different research teams throughout Latin America and the world. And we can identify that the accumulated plastic waste to 2022 throws a total of 87,000 tons of export, which has been sustained in the past few years. And 2 years ago, in 2021, January 1st, new legislation was passed as an amendment of the transborder plastic waste trade with the objective of reducing this trade as the negative effect of this trade is creating in our environment. Total import and export accumulated in the item 3915, we can identify exports and imports in a decrease in the past few years, particularly In 2019, the global market, as a result of the closing of the borders of China, in 2019, in Chile, both exports and imports of this type of waste has decreased, but exports of these types of waste was directed in the interregional traffic. So within the region, I would say in 2022, 70% of the exported waste was sent to Latin America. Imports have dropped significantly without going over 500,000 tons. But if we see the composition of what is being imported and exported, next slide, please, we can identify that as of this red long line that divides the before and after of this new law or new amendment of Basel, we can see the decrease of import and export of plastic waste. Even so, the export of waste, and we have to be very careful about that to see what is happening there, is that exports of 2021 and 2022 consider then the polymer, the vinyl polymers, which are toxic in its composition and treatment. So the Basel amendment restricts its transfer when there's the corresponding documentation, in this case of the exporter country. Talking about the destination of this waste, we've identified 5 of them: Ecuador, Guatemala in Latin America, the US, and during 2022, every export of PVC were sent to Ecuador. They were not higher than 300,000 tons, which is quite low compared to waste movement in the past, but it's still significant. But we have to be careful because it still has toxic composition. Next slide, please. Now, when we analyze the textile waste movement, and this is where I will make a cross-reference with what the Cierto Vestido and Fashion Revolution have presented, we see that the total export and import, as you see in the chart here, is export is really leading the transbordering trade of textile waste. So we can be considered an export country within the region. And as the bibliography quotes, both local and international bibliography, Chile is the #1 destination in South America, as well as African countries. Yes, such as Kenya, thank you, such as Kenya, where we can consult with quite some bibliography in terms of their supply chain. So we see these large numbers. We see how we can identify what's been imported to the country came with the origin of the non-defined countries, which was difficult to assess, but we could identify after some research that it comes from countries that repeats themselves internationally, such as the United States and the EU. We identified that North America has imported the largest amount of waste. We see 79,000 tons that are not registered in an easy, friendly manner with customs office, but we want to identify which was the country that acquired this waste, and they come from countries in Europe, such as Germany and Spain and the United States as well. And if we want to move to other regions of the world, such as the Asia Pacific area, with low imports levels, we can see countries such as Japan and China, mainly Japan, I would say. And why do I say this? Most of the countries that show up in these customs analysis are really countries that have this fast fashion industry where they have overproduction And we could actually trace this quite accurately. As we see, the exports are quite low, and it's quite shocking to say the import or to see the import figures. When talking about countries that are not identified, one step before this, identifying the acquisition port, helped us identify these 15 countries or places, such as the Iquique Free Trade Area, which is really not easy to identify what this code really corresponds to, but we did identify some other origins, such as countries that are developed countries with very high rates of production, and they actually confirm the colonialism trend of this transportation of waste. Finally, and assessing the tariff headings or tariff items, there were 17 of them that were identified as sent to Chile. We could actually conclude two findings with Manuel. 43% of the imported material to Chile was imported out of the item 63090099. So these are other textiles. This is quite a paradox because as with plastic waste, which also are under the category others, these are data bags that with textile waste, we discover that arrive in our country with high levels of contamination, which really makes its treatment a lot more complex in the destination country, amongst other issues. Something else worth mentioning is that during 2022, the total tariff items were reduced to 4 of them, which were never registered in the previous years. And I'm talking about 63, 09, 00, 11, 12, 13, and 19. As you can see on the screen here over the dotted line, you can see that 63, 09, 00, 11 in the upper part of the chart throws a total number of more than 15,000 tons, which really messed up our follow-up activities because we were not sure what was happening there and why everything was gathered under one heading and the other 3 were reduced to less than 2,000 tons. So these were the findings in a very general manner. When talking about textile waste, we've identified repeated logics as those in Africa in terms of supply chains. Their main origin of imports is really the EU, which is not the case of Latin America, where we add official exports to those that are not acknowledged in terms of its origin. We can identify that total imports coming from North America is almost 50% of the total amount of what we export, and 34% remaining comes from Europe. In other words, we're saying that 80% of what we receive in Chile comes from developed countries, and we believe this is a colonialist practice from our view here in Chile. Thank you, Matias. Well, we were trying to gather data in this. Can you all hear me? Yes, good. When we analyze, well, part of my job, when we process and interpret these data, how in order to see how we can move forward, I think what we do at the Alliance is to set an objective and create awareness and advocacy on these structural changes that are so much needed. And in this regard, anyone else speaking, maybe?
In that regard, what we can research into to advocate for public policies. It's not only a matter of surveying data for the sake of doing this, but we must do it for advocacy purposes. Working with all civil society organizations with the aim of producing or bringing about a change. We have a data comparison here that we believe is interesting. The import of waste in Chile is at a low level regarding the tariff heading 3915 compared to what's exported. In the second report, we said that Chile had a colonialist-based attitude, so saying that someone else should take over the waste and deal with it, sending waste to other countries. If you can't, see to it here, you think that somebody elsewhere can obtain economic gains on, but that's false from the very beginning. But comparing data, this was the behavior, but for textile waste, it's the other way around. It's important to mention this because it's based on the idea of how we are showing data. It's not only a matter of identifying each of the headings, the origin and other pivotal effects. Some move from one continent to another and arrive at a port, are recorded there or registered there, but then end up elsewhere. So it's not that easy to follow up on waste overall because there are records that may show several tons that entered the country but then ended up elsewhere. So we've got to work on an ongoing basis with our colleagues from other Latin American and Caribbean countries to go about this. This is a sort of summary of how we view Chile. Chile exports is a great plastic waste exporter, but imports a great amount of textile waste. It's a paradox. I mean, Beatrice already mentioned this, that the issue is the amount of plastic and synthetic fiber content of the waste. Of the 161,000 tons that we identified within these more or less 7 years of research work. We could carry out more detailed analysis anyhow, but of all this amount, imagine the amount of plastic that came with it. It's a paradox to think that the clothes coming in with plastic contents that, as Bastian and Javiera said, then becomes available, is available everywhere. We've got to look at it from a public policy perspective and see what we are going to do. There are a few questions that come up, and this has to do with a national scenario for those that are participating from abroad. We have an extended producer responsibility law in Chile. They're called the REP law, which is currently being implemented. But within this scenario of this current law 20,982, will the packaging and packages, plastic packaging and packets increase? But how much of this plastic waste will end up as exported waste? Because since we work as a network at the international level and know how waste moves around, we won't go to a country or send this to a country that has an ERP law. Because if we can't address this problem, they won't be able to do so either. And then Chile ratified the plastics amendment of the Basel Convention. What protocols are we going to demand or propose? For instance, regarding the 200 tons of PVC that went to Ecuador, and then Peru is another recipient country of PVC particularly. And I mentioned PVC in this question because it's a plastic that brings about greater concern. Those that are participating and are more expert in plastics will know how important PVC is. Where are the records, or which are the industries receiving PVC? I mean, those are some of the questions we are wondering about. And then as to the heading 3915, in the last 2 years, Chile exported 6,000 tons, 34,000 in 8 years of this kind of waste. When we talked about the plastic waste exported by Chile under 3915, of those 34,000 tons for other plastics. We said it in the second report, and now we are repeating it in the third report. We are very much concerned about the breakdown of other plastics because they're a combination of many, those that we mentioned under 3915, but also others. It's a weakness not to be able to identify this well. I mean, there's a lot of cross pollution here. Those working in the recycling of plastics know what all this is about. When you put all of the plastic waste together, the possibility of recycling is impossible. So we are worried about that, because plastics is a category that will continue growing. This is a trend too. So we were wondering what the strategy would be in the case of the Basel Convention and the regulations at the country level. We've got to see how it is carried from port to port and what are the regulations and protocols to be followed by Chile before they leave our country. It should be a preventive question somehow. This, I'm mixing headings, and I apologize for that, but we are very much concerned about two things under this 6309, which is clothing. There is something of great concern here. Fashion Revolution mentioned what they found at the country level, and they talked about the dump sites in the north. But what's of concern is what's happening here. If you look at the two bars on the right-hand side, you'll realize that Valparaíso and San Antonio, as to clothing imports, both of them combined is the amount is higher than that enters at Iquique. And if you add up Coronel Liquén and San Vicente plus all these, plus these couple of other bars, that is more than what entered through the port of Iquique. So at the national waste management level, we were wondering where are the clothes that were not sold somehow. We could choose assumptions, but most probably the clothes that came in through San Antonio and Valparaiso ended up in Santiago, which is in the middle of the country. And the unused clothes is probably in this area in a dump site. And in the case of the Biobío region, these three are equal to the amount of clothes coming in through Iquique, and the same must happen there. We are worried about overall management within our country because we are bringing clothes to send them to the landfills and dump sites, which are sites that have limited duration. So we've heard a lot of justification as to the clothes coming in, but this is of great concern because most of the landfills and dump sites in Chile are saturated already. And this will bring about unprecedented economic and social impacts. This is of great concern indeed in the case of the Desierto Vestido or dress desert. It's very clear where clothes are, but in the center of the country, it is not that clear. And the last couple of questions we wanted to ask in view of the next panel is, where have all the garments, worn garments, gone to? We were wondering, are they in dump sites, in landfills? Landfills are very costly. Manu, could you go slower, please? I'm going to go back to the question then. Where has all this clothing gone to? The worn clothes, we were thinking about then most probably being in dump sites or landfills or buried somewhere. The second question we asked ourselves was regarding textile waste and which are the most urgent measures to address this problem. Is it the circular economy? There are regulations, and we look at the regulations and say, well, the data are of concern from two standpoints. And with this, I want to wrap up the idea of our presentation and interpretation of data. Chile in the region has good waste management. It's expensive. We receive more waste plastics than the rest. But then clothes are coming in under an economic justification. If Chile could can manage waste well, will that be based on exporting it to other countries? Because we can't undertake the commitment. I mean, there are many questions, underlying questions that have to do with a model, but we need to think about public policies and regulations in this regard. Thank you.